1. Jim's early life. In the eastern ports where he worked for most of his life, Jim was very popular. He was an excellent seaman who was liked and trusted by everyone. He was tall and strongly built, with a deep voice and a confident way of talking. To his employers and the ship captains, he was just Jim, nothing more. He had a special reason for not wanting people to know his other name. But nothing remained secret for long in seaports, and soon someone who knew about his past was certain to arrive. When this happened, Jim always left his well-paid job immediately and moved on to another port. Over several years, he was known first in Bombay, then Calcutta, then Rangoon, Penang, and Jakarta, as he moved towards the rising sun. Finally, when he could no longer bear this kind of life, he ran away from seaports and white men forever, hiding himself in the jungle, in a distant Malaysian village, far away from anyone who knew him. The natives of the village gave him an extra name. They called him Tuan Jim, or, as we would say, Lord Jim. Jim had spent his childhood in a comfortable, peaceful home in the southwest of England. His father was a vicar, a kind man who always did his duty, and who had no doubts about what was right or wrong. The family house was warm and welcoming, with plenty of room for Jim and his 4 older brothers to play in. Close to it, on a hill, was the small grey church, standing like a rock where it had stood for centuries. There had been vicars in Jim's family for 100 years, but one of his brothers had already shown an interest in the church, so his father had to find some other work for his youngest son. When Jim spent a whole summer reading sea stories, his father was delighted and decided that Jim would join the merchant navy at once. He was sent to a training ship on a busy, wide river near London. There, 200 boys slept, ate and worked together, learning everything a sailor needs to know. Because he was strong and quick and intelligent, he learnt fast and was generally liked. The work seemed easy to him, and he was confident of his bravery in any danger. Sometimes, at night, he used to forget the crowd of noisy boys around him and escape into his own dream world of sea stories. He saw himself swimming bravely through the waves to save passengers from sinking ships, fighting natives on lonely islands, and giving orders to frightened sailors to save their lives. He was always the brave man who did his duty, just like the heroes in the stories that he had read at home. One evening he heard a sudden shout. "Something's happened! On deck, all of you! Hurry!" He jumped to his feet and joined the other boys as they ran up onto the deck. It was a dark and stormy night. The wind was blowing strongly and heavy rain was falling. Jim stood without moving, staring at the cruel black waves. Was it him that the storm wanted? What would it be like to fall into that cold water and drown? "Send the lifeboat out!" came the order. In the darkness, 2 small ships had crashed into each other, and there were distant voices crying for help. Boys ran past Jim, who still did not move. They jumped into the lifeboat and began to row as fast as they could towards the 2 damaged ships. "Row together, you young dogs!" shouted a voice from the boat, "if you want to save any lives!" Jim had now run to the side of the ship and was looking down. He felt a hand on his shoulder. "Too late, young man," said the captain. Jim looked up, disappointed. The captain smiled. "Better luck next time," he said. "This will teach you to move quickly in an emergency. The lifeboat came dancing back through the waves, half full of water. The boys had saved 2 men, who now lay exhausted in the bottom of the boat. Jim no longer felt afraid of the sea. It seemed to him that he cared nothing for the storm. He would live through greater dangers than that, and would show the world how brave he was. That night he sat alone, while the boys who had saved the 2 men's lives told their excited friends the whole story. When they described the waves and the cold and the sinking ships, Jim felt angry. They were so proud of what they had done. He too had wanted to show his bravery, but perhaps it was better this way. He had learnt more from this experience than any of them. The next time a brave man was needed, he alone, he felt sure, would know how to fight the wind and the seas. And as the other boys talked and laughed together, Jim dreamed happily of the next adventure and his chance to prove himself. After 2 years of training, he went to sea. He made many voyages on many different ships, but surprisingly, there were no adventures. The sea had not yet tested him, or shown him the secret truth of his pretenses. However, although he was still very young, he soon became chief mate of a fine ship. Unfortunately, he was badly hurt during a storm at sea, and when the ship reached an eastern port, he was taken to hospital. His broken leg needed time to mend, and so he was left behind when his ship sailed away. Time passed slowly in the hospital, where the patients played cards and slept and told each other's stories. There were brightly coloured flowers in the gardens, and warm, soft air blew in through the open windows. The hospital was on a hill, and had an excellent view of the port, which was always busy, as it was on one of the main sea routes to the east. Jim felt wonderfully calm as he looked out every day at the ships like toys in the sea, with the endless blue of the eastern sky above, and the smiling peace of the eastern seas all around. As soon as he could walk, he left the hospital and started looking for a ship to take him back to England. While waiting, he naturally spent time with other European seamen in the port. Many of them had become lazy. They were used to the easy life of a white sailor in the East, and did not want to return to the bad weather, harder conditions, and more dangerous duties of the West. They talked, not of work, but of luck, and chance, and money. At first, Jim refused to listen to them, but soon he began to find these men strangely interesting. How did they make a success of their lives, with so little work and so little danger? And suddenly he decided not to go home to England, and took a job as chief mate of the Patna. The Patna was a local ship, as old as the hills, and in very bad condition. Her captain was a German, whose home was in Australia. A very large, fat, cruel man, who felt that he owed no duty to anybody. He had arranged to take 800 pilgrims to the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Jim watched as the native people hurried onto the ship, filling every corner like water in a container. 800 men and women had come from north and south, from islands and villages, over mountains and down rivers. At the call of an idea, they had left their forests, their farms, their homes, strong men, young boys, little girls, women with heads covered, and sleeping babies. "Look at these animals," said the German captain to his new chief mate. The Patna left the port and started across the Indian Ocean towards the Red Sea. The 5 white seamen lived separately from the pilgrims, who were packed close together on every deck and in every corner. The days were hot and heavy, and the ship moved slowly across a flat, lifeless sea. There were no clouds in the burning sky, and it was too hot to think or feel. The nights were beautiful. A wonderful calm seemed to cover the world, and the young moon shone down on the smooth, cool sea. Jim thought that there was nothing but peace and happiness in nature, as he breathed in the soft air, while in all the dark corners around him the pilgrims slept, trusting the white men to keep them safe. 2 Malays stood silently at the wheel. Jim walked along the deck and looked at the dark water. He did not see the shadow of what was to come. In fact, he felt that nothing could hurt him on a night like this. He had been responsible for the ship for several hours now, and he was feeling sleepy. "Anything to report?" The captain had come up noiselessly behind him. His face was red, with one eye half closed, the other staring and glassy. His fat body shook when he walked, and his clothes were dirty and unbuttoned. Jim answered his captain politely, but moved a little away from the ugly figure who had destroyed the night's peace. The ship continued to move smoothly over the flat sea. "You can't imagine how hot it is down below," said a voice. It was the young second engineer, who had come up on deck for some fresh air. He did not seem able to speak clearly. "Why I work on this old ship I don't know," he went on. "We engineers work twice as hard as you sailors, and—" "Don't speak to me like that, you dog!" shouted the captain. "Where did you get your drink?" "Not from you, Captain," laughed the engineer. "You're too mean for that. No, the good old chief gave me some." The chief engineer was a well-known drinker who normally kept his drink to himself. Tonight, however, he had given some to the second engineer, who was not used to it. The chief and the captain had worked together on many ships, and people in the Patna's home port said that they had been guilty of every crime you could think of at one time or another. Jim watched the captain getting angrier and angrier, and the young man shouting louder and louder. He smiled to himself. These men did not belong to the world of adventure. They had nothing to do with him. He was almost asleep on his feet. Suddenly the engineer was thrown forward onto his face and lay silent on the deck. Jim and the captain stared at the calm sea and looked up at the stars. What had happened? They could still hear the engines turning. Had the earth stopped? Now the cloudless sky and the quiet sea looked less safe than before. "What was that?" cried the engineer, holding his arm in pain. There was a noise like distant thunder, and the ship trembled. The 2 Malays at the wheel looked at the white men, but received no orders, so did not move. The Patna lifted a little in the water, and then continued smoothly on her way. 2. Marlowe meets Jim. A month or so later, at the official inquiry, Jim was asked what had happened to the Patna. Trying to describe the experience honestly, he replied, "The ship went over whatever it was as easily as oil running over a stick." The inquiry was held in the crowded police court of an eastern port. Jim stood there in front of them all, while many eyes looked at him out of dark, white and red faces, like staring shadows. They saw a large, good-looking young man with a straight back and unhappy eyes. The 3 judges, 2 of whom were sea captains, sat together under a large window. They asked Jim clear questions, which he answered truthfully. Outside, the sun was beating down, and the air was heavy in the courtroom. Jim's voice seemed very loud to him. It was the only sound in the world. The painful questions they asked him appeared to come from inside him, like the questioning of his conscience.
So, after you realized the ship had hit something underwater, your captain ordered you to go and see if there was any damage? Asked one of the sea captains.
Yes, said Jim. I discovered a big hole in the metal wall of the ship below the water. I didn't think of danger just then. I was surprised, because it had happened so quickly. I was on my way back to tell the captain when I met the second engineer. He had broken his left arm when he was thrown forward earlier. When I told him about the damage, he cried, "My God, the whole ship will be full of water in a minute!" He pushed me away with his right arm and ran up onto the bridge, shouting as he went. I followed him and was in time to see the captain hit him. The captain ordered him to keep quiet and go and stop the engines. Jim hoped that if he described everything exactly and gave all the facts, the people in the courtroom would understand the full horror of it. Every small detail of what had happened was important. Fortunately, he remembered it all very clearly. There was something else as well, something unseen and evil that had helped cause the disaster. He wished to make that clear. He wanted to go on talking, to find out the truth. But although he spoke calmly and carefully, he felt like a trapped animal, desperately searching for a way out. The questioning continued. Jim was beginning to feel very tired. His mouth was tastelessly dry, and his head felt hot, while the rest of his body was cold. While he waited for the next question, his eyes rested on a white man sitting by himself. He had a worn, clouded face with clear, quiet eyes. Jim answered another question and wanted to cry out. "Is it worth going on? Is it really worth it?" He met the eyes of the white man, who was looking at him differently from all the others in the courtroom. It was an honest, intelligent look. Telling the truth was not enough, thought Jim. Words were no good to him any longer, and that man appeared to understand his hopeless difficulty. That stranger with the clear, quiet eyes was Marlowe, and later on, in distant parts of the world, Marlowe often remembered Jim and talked about him. It was usually after dinner in a friend's house, when men sat comfortably in their armchairs on the veranda and smoked their cigars, that Marlowe was asked to talk. In the darkness, as he sat surrounded by sweet-smelling flowers and a group of listening men, every detail of that fresh young face and straight figure came back to Marlowe. He could almost imagine himself back in the past, and he often began with a warning to his listeners. My friends, it's easy enough to talk about young Jim, but don't be too quick to judge him. A good dinner, an excellent cigar, and a beautiful evening of freshness and starlight like this make us forget how difficult life can be. We all try to do what is right, but the best of us can take the wrong route occasionally. Yes, I was at the official inquiry and saw Jim there, but I had seen him before. The first news we had of the Patna was a mysterious message from Aden that a damaged ship full of pilgrims had been found without its officers in the Indian Ocean. The whole waterfront, boatmen, natives, officials, clerks, talked of nothing else for 2 weeks. Then, one fine morning, I was standing near the port office when I saw 4 men walking towards me, and suddenly realized that they must be the missing officers from the Patna. I recognized the captain, a fat, ugly German, who was well known in all the eastern ports as an irresponsible and dishonest seaman. Behind him was the chief engineer, a tall, thin man, and the second engineer with a broken arm. The fourth was a young man with fair hair and square shoulders, who stood with his hands in his pockets, turning his back on the others. This was my first view of Jim, and I was strangely interested in him, because he looked so clean-faced, so strong, so brave. I felt almost angry. If a man who looks like that can go wrong, I thought, who can you trust? Captain Elliot was the chief port official in those days, and as soon as he realized the captain of the Patna had arrived, he sent for him. Elliot believed strongly in duty and responsibility, and didn't mind who he shouted at. Through the open windows of his office, we all heard what he thought of the Patna's captain, and in a very few moments the fat man came running angrily out of Elliot's office. He saw me looking at him and said, "That crazy Englishman in there called me a dog." I smiled. Dog was the politest word that had reached me. "But I don't care," he continued, his face purple with anger. "The Pacific is big, my friend. If you English take away my master's certificate, if you won't let me command a ship here, I'll go to Apia, to Honolulu. They know me there." I could easily imagine what kind of people knew him there. I looked over at the young man again, wanting to see him angry, unhappy, ashamed. But he looked completely unworried, and I couldn't understand it. I liked the look of him. He appeared to be that good, honest kind of man who is not interested in ideas, but who does his work well and lives his life bravely to the end. I've had my own ship for a long time now, and I've trained enough young sailors in my time to be able to judge whether you can trust a man or not. It worried me that perhaps I had made a mistake with Jim. Was there something missing in his character? What had made him act like that? The two engineers were now standing in front of their captain, but he turned away from them and hurried over to a horse and trap. He climbed in, shouted impatiently at the driver, and before anyone could do anything to stop him, the horse and trap disappeared in a cloud of dust. Where did he go? To Apia or Honolulu? Nobody ever saw him again. At the official inquiry, which took place a week later and lasted 3 days, Jim was the only one who was questioned. The captain had escaped, and both the engineers were in hospital. The one with the broken arm had a bad fever, and the chief engineer had been drinking brandy for 3 days and could no longer talk sensibly. In my opinion, the only truth worth knowing was not how, but why the officers had left the ship, and I realized the inquiry would not discover this. Judges are not paid to look into a man's soul, but only to see the results of his actions. One of the inquiry officials was Captain Brierley, known in all the eastern ports as a brave officer and an excellent seaman. Young, healthy, and successful, he seemed to be one of those lucky men who never make a mistake, and who therefore have a high opinion of themselves. We all thought nothing could touch him or his self-confidence. But we were wrong, because he killed himself a week after the inquiry. I think now that while the other two judges were questioning Jim, Brierley was holding his own silent inquiry, questioning himself. I think his conscience was accusing him of who knows what. It wasn't anything to do with money or drink or women, but at the end of it, He found himself guilty and drowned himself, leaving letters for his chief mate and the ship's owners. During the inquiry, I had a conversation with him, which I remember especially well, because of his sudden death only a few days later. He spoke to me at the end of the first day. "Don't you think it's stupid?" he asked me angrily. I looked at him in surprise. Brierly was normally very calm. "Why are we attacking that young man? Why should he eat all that dirt? Why doesn't he run away?" "He probably hasn't any money," I answered. "We should put an end to this now," Brierly continued. "This kind of thing destroys people's confidence in us seamen. I'll give you some money, Marlowe, and you talk to him. Tell him to leave. Give him another chance. People will forget about it very soon, and he can get on with his life. Of course, I can't suggest this to him myself, but you could." And so I saw, just for a moment, the real Brierly. Naturally, I refused to do what he wanted, because I didn't like the way he expected me to arrange Jim's escape, and because I thought it was brave of Jim to accept the blame. I certainly did not realize how important it was to Brierly, who was perhaps remembering some mistake in his own past. At the end of the second day of the inquiry, I was talking to someone I knew while leaving the courtroom. I noticed Jim's wide shoulders in front of us. My friend saw a yellow dog running between people's legs and said with a laugh, "Look at that miserable dog." I saw Jim turn round immediately. He stepped forward and stared at me. My friend reached the door and went out, and the crowd disappeared. Suddenly, Jim and I were alone, where there had been hundreds of people a few moments earlier. The building was strangely silent. "Did you speak to me?" asked Jim, very low. His face was darkening, and he looked violent. "No," I said, watching him. "You've made a mistake." "I won't let anyone call me names outside this court," he said. I could see that he was deeply angry, although he spoke so quietly. "But I really don't know what you mean," I said, trying hard to remember what I had said or done. "I'll soon show you I'm not a dog," he cried, moving towards me. Then finally I understood. "My God," I said, "you don't think I called you a—" "But I'm sure I heard someone say it," he replied. Silently, I showed him the corner of the building where the dog was sitting in the shadows. At first, he did not seem to understand. Then he looked surprised, and then ashamed. The red of his fair, sunburnt skin deepened suddenly from his neck right up to his hair. I felt very sorry for him. He had opened his soul to me and got nothing back. He turned and ran outside. I had to run fast to catch up with him and started a breathless conversation. By now his self-control had returned, and he apologized. "You see," he explained, "there are so many staring people in court who probably think what I thought you said. In court I have to accept that, and I do, but outside it's different." I don't pretend I understood him, but I wanted to know more about him, so I invited him to dinner at the Malabar House Hotel, where I was staying. 3. Jim tells his story. The big hotel dining room was more than half full of people, eating, drinking and talking, while the dark-faced waiters hurried from table to table. And opposite me sat Jim, with his blue, boyish eyes looking straight into mine. I liked his young, honest face and his seriousness. He was the right kind. He was one of us. But how could he talk so calmly? Was it because he was controlling himself, or because he did not care? Towards the end of dinner, I mentioned the inquiry. "It must be awfully hard for you," I said. I was surprised by what happened next. He put out a hand quickly and held my arm, staring fixedly at me. "It is hell!" he cried. People at tables near us turned to look. I stood up and we went outside to sit on the veranda with our coffee and cigars. From our chairs we looked out at the sea where the lights of the ships shone like stars in the thick, warm darkness. "I couldn't run away," Jim began. "The captain did, but that's no good for me. The others have got out of it too, but I couldn't, and I wouldn't. I can never go home now, you know. I'm sure my dear old dad has seen the story in the newspapers by now. I can never explain all this to the poor old man. He wouldn't understand." I looked up. I had the feeling he was extremely fond of his old dad, and I imagined how proud the country vicar had been of his sailor son. Jim went on. "Look, you mustn't think I'm like those others, you know, the captain and the engineers. What happened to me was different." I said nothing to agree or disagree with this, but I didn't know if he really believed what he was saying. "I don't know what I'll do after the inquiry. Nobody will employ me as an officer again. I haven't any money to go anywhere else. I'll have to get occasional work on a ship as an ordinary seaman." "Do you think you can?" I asked. I wanted to hurt him, to break his self-control. He jumped up and turned away, then came back and looked miserably down at me. "Why did you say that? You've been very kind to me. You didn't laugh when I—" Here his voice trembled. "Made that stupid mistake." Looking away from me, he stared into the darkness. "It's a question of being ready. I wasn't. Not then." And then, turning to me, "Look, I'd like to explain. I'd like somebody to understand. One person at least. You! Why not you? Ah, what a chance I missed! My God, what a chance I missed!" He was silent for a while, with a quiet, distant look in his eyes, as he thought of that lost opportunity. I watched him moving into his own private world of heroic dreams and adventures. Ah, he was romantic. He was very far away from me, although his chair was only a metre away from mine. Suddenly I saw from his delighted expression that he had reached the heart of his impossible world and come to the end of his perfect dream. His young face wore a smile that your faces will never wear, my friends, nor mine either. I brought him roughly back to the present by saying, "You missed a chance when you left the ship, you mean?" He turned quickly towards me, his dream broken and his eyes suddenly full of pain. "You see," he said after a moment, "the hole in the side of the ship was so big, a piece of metal as big as my hand fell off while I was looking at it." "That made you feel bad?" I said. "Do you suppose I was thinking of myself? There were 800 people on that ship and only 7 boats. I expected to see the hole widen and the water flow over them as they lay sleeping. What could I do?" He passed a hand over his head. "The captain has sent me to check the damage again. At first I wanted to wake all the passengers up, but my mouth was too dry and I couldn't speak. I felt completely helpless. When I looked at the unconscious sleepers around me, I saw dead men. Nothing could save them. There was no time. I could not repair the damage, and I could not save 800 people in 7 boats. I saw, as clearly as I see you now, that there was nothing I could do. It seemed to take all the life out of my body. I just stood there and waited. Do you think I'm afraid of death?" He banged his hand angrily on the table, so that the coffee cups danced. "My God, I tell you I am not." He was not afraid of death, perhaps, but, my friends, I'll tell you what he was afraid of: the emergency. He was able to imagine only too well all the horrors of the end: water filling the ship, people screaming, boats sinking, all the terrible details of a disaster at sea. I think he was ready to die, but I suspect he wanted to die quietly, peacefully. Not many men are prepared to continue their fight to the end when they find themselves losing to a much stronger enemy, like the sea. The engines had stopped, and it seemed very quiet on the ship, he went on. I ran back up to the bridge and found the captain and the 2 engineers trying to lower one of the ship's boats down into the sea. "Quick!" the captain whispered to me. "Help us, man!" "Aren't you going to do something?" I asked. "Yes, I'm going to get away," he said over his shoulder. I didn't understand then what he meant. The 3 of them were desperately pulling and pushing at the boat and calling each other's names, but something was wrong with the ropes, and the boat wouldn't move. I stood away from them, watching the sea, black and calm and deadly. My head was full of ideas, and I was thinking hard, but I couldn't see any chance of survival for us. You think I'm a coward because I just stood there, but what would you do? You can't tell. Nobody can. I needed time. He was breathing quickly. He was not speaking to me, but seemed to be on trial in front of an unseen judge who was responsible for his soul. This was a matter too difficult for the court of inquiry to decide. It was about the true nature of life, about light and darkness, truth and lies, good and evil. As he spoke, his eyes shone. Ever since I was a boy, I've been preparing myself for difficulties and danger. I was ready, I tell you, ready for anything, but... And the light went out of his face. This was so unexpected. Well, I'll tell you the rest. As I was standing there on the bridge, the 2nd engineer ran up and begged me to help them. I pushed him away. In fact, I hit him. "Won't you save your own life, you coward?" he cried. "Coward?" That's what he called me. Jim threw himself back in his chair and laughed loudly. I had never heard anything as bitter as that noise. All around us on the veranda, conversation stopped. People stared at him. After a while, he continued with his story. "I was saying to the Patna, 'Sink! Go on, sink!' I wanted it to finish. Then, in the sky, I saw a big black thundercloud coming towards us, and I knew the ship couldn't survive a storm. I saw that George, the 3rd engineer, had now joined the other 3, who were still trying to get the boat lowered. Suddenly, George fell backwards and lay without moving on the deck. He was dead. Heart trouble, I think. And just then there was a loud crash as the captain and the 2 others managed to get the boat down into the water. They were in the boat, and I could hear them shouting from below, "Jump, George, jump!" Jim trembled a little, and then sat very still as he relived the awful moment. There were 800 living people on that ship, and they were shouting for the one dead man to jump. "Jump, George, we'll catch you!" I felt the ship move. I thought she was going down, under me. Jim put his hand to his head again and paused for a moment. "I had jumped, it seems," he added. His clear blue eyes looked miserably at me, and I felt like an old man helplessly watching a childish disaster. "It seems you did," I agreed. "When I was in the boat, I wished I could die, but I couldn't go back. I jumped into an everlasting deep hole." Nothing could be more true. He described to me the full horror of the hours he spent in that small boat with the 3 men. They called him evil names, angrily accused him of killing George, even talked of throwing him out of the boat. "I didn't care what happened to me," Jim went on. I wondered if I would go crazy or kill myself. You see, I had saved my own life, while everything that was important to me had sunk with the ship in the night. We were certain the ship had sunk, you know. As we rowed away, we couldn't hear any cries or see her lights. The captain said we were lucky to survive, and I decided not to kill myself. The right thing was to go on. Wait for another chance. Test myself. After a long silence, he continued. Another ship picked us up the next day. The captain and the others pretended we had tried to save the passengers, but the Patna had sunk too fast. The story didn't matter to me. I had jumped, hadn't I? That's what I had to live with. It was like cheating the dead. And there were no dead, I said. He turned away from me at that. I knew that a French ship had found the Patna sailing out of control. The captain had put several of his officers on board, and they sailed her to the nearest port, Aden. Although the Patna was badly damaged, it had not sunk, and nobody had died, except George, the third engineer, whose body was found on the bridge. The pilgrims were all put onto other ships to continue their journey to Mecca. But everybody went on talking about the Patna, and now, when seamen met in the eastern ports, they very often discussed the strange story of the pilgrim ship and the officers who ran away, just as I am telling you about it tonight. 4. Marlowe offers to help. Our coffee and cigars were finished. I knew that tomorrow, or was it today, it was well past midnight, the inquiry judges would take up the weapon of the law and punish Jim. I told myself repeatedly that the young man was guilty, but I wanted to help him get away. My friends, if you can't understand my reasons, you haven't been listening to me all this time. So I suggested Brierly's plan of escape to Jim. I would lend him some money, he could pay it back when he liked, and I would also write a letter to a friend of mine in Rangoon, who would give him a job. Jim could leave that same day and save himself the shame of the final day in the crowded courthouse. I was impatient to begin writing the letter immediately, but Jim refused. "Run away? No, I couldn't think of it," he said, shaking his head. "It's awfully good of you, but no." I'm sure that things looked terribly uncertain to him at that moment, but he did not hesitate. He was young and strong, and there was something fine in his wild hope that he would survive. I felt angry, however. "The whole miserable business is bitter enough for a man like you," I started saying. "Yes, it is," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the floor. The way he spoke touched me to the heart. "The captain escaped. The others went to hospital. They all got away." He waved them scornfully away with his hand. "But I've got to accept this thing. I'm not going to avoid any of it." "Oh, really, my dear man," I said crossly. "You don't understand," he replied, looking straight into my eyes. "I jumped, but I don't run away." Neither of us knew how to continue the conversation. I stood up at last, saying, "I had no idea it was so late." "I expect you've had enough of this," he said, "and to tell you the truth, so have I." Well, he had refused my offer of help, and he was ready to go now. Outside, the night was waiting for him, quietly and dangerously. For a few seconds we stood together silently. "What will you do after, I asked very low. "Go to hell, probably," he replied. I judged it best to answer lightly. "Please, remember, I would very much like to see you before you go." "Nothing will prevent you," he said bitterly. "Everybody will know where I am." And then, as we said goodbye, he stupidly imagined that I did not want to shake hands with him. First he offered his hand, then pulled back, then hesitated, then It was too awful for words. I had to shout at him, "Jim, shake hands with me, man!" Finally, it was over, and he disappeared into the night. I heard his heavy footsteps. He was running, with nowhere to go to, and he was only 23. Next morning, the last day of the inquiry, I was in court again. It was really very wrong of me, because my chief mate was expecting me to visit my ship, but I had to know what would happen to Jim. Outside, the streets were full of colour and bright sunshine, but the courtroom was dark and airless. Jim stood there, pink and fair and serious, while the judge spoke.
This court has decided that the officers of the Patna, who were responsible for all the ship's passengers, were guilty of forgetting their clear duty when they left the ship in the moment of danger. The court has therefore decided to take away the master certificates of the captain and chief mate.
The room was silent. Then people started to leave. I saw Jim, his face as black as thunder, walking out slowly and a little uncertainly. As I was watching him, a man called Chester spoke to me. I knew him a little. He was a West Australian who normally traded in the Pacific, but had come here looking for a cheap ship to buy. He watched Jim walking away.
"That young man's no good, is he?" he said. "But I can give him a job. I've discovered a guano island among the Walpo rocks, which is going to make me rich. It's rocky and a little bit dangerous to land there. I can't get anybody to take the job, but I need a man to do the work there for me. I don't care if he's a bit of a coward or hasn't got his certificate. He'll have 40 natives to collect the guano, and I'll give him a couple of guns, of course. You could persuade him to take the job, Marlowe, couldn't you?"
I stared at him in horror. I knew the place he was talking about. There was no water on the island, and very little rain fell there. I had a sudden picture of Jim on the shadowless rock, up to his knees in guano, with the screams of seabirds in his ears, and the sun beating down on his head. "I wouldn't advise my worst enemy to accept your offer," I said scornfully.
"It's just the job for him," Chester smiled unpleasantly. "I can promise the island wouldn't sink under him. I believe he's a bit sensitive on that question."
"Good morning," I said sharply, and walked away, leaving him staring angrily after me. I hurried down to the waterside and found Jim looking miserably at the sea. He didn't hear me come up, but turned quickly when I touched his shoulder. He followed me back to the hotel obediently. I realized that he had nowhere in the whole world where he could be alone with his suffering. He spent the rest of the day in my room, where he stood looking out on the veranda while I sat at my desk, busily writing letters. We did not speak to each other. I wrote all the letters I owed people, and then I wrote to people who would certainly be surprised to receive a letter from me. It became dark, and still I went on writing. It was clear that he was very unhappy. Occasionally I saw his strong shoulders shaking, and I was glad his family could not see him like that. Suddenly, with a crash, he pushed open the glass door onto the veranda and stepped out into the blackness, standing there like a lonely figure by a dark and hopeless sea. I began to think he was taking it all too seriously. Should I persuade him to accept Chester's offer? I knew there was nothing except myself between him and the dark sea. But I said nothing. The time was coming when I would hear him described as a hero. It's true, I tell you. Towards the end he found honour and a perfect happiness in the Malaysian jungle. When I saw him for the last time, a few years later, he was completely in control. Strong and successful, loved and trusted by the natives of Patusan. But that is not the way I remember him. I shall always see his lonely, shaking figure on that hotel veranda, suffering in the darkness. A crash of thunder made me lift my head, and lightning suddenly lit up the night. A few moments later, we were in the middle of a storm, with an angry wind shaking the windows. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Well, that's over," he said, sounding almost normal. This encouraged me to look up at him. "I think I'm all right now," he went on. "Thank you for letting me here in your room. Nowhere else to go." The rain was falling heavily on the veranda by now. "Well, goodbye," he said, and turned to go. "Wait! Come back!" I cried. "Look, let me help you." "You can't," he replied miserably. "I can't take money." "It's not money I'm offering you," I answered angrily. "Look at this letter I'm writing. It's to a man I know well, asking him to give you work. I would only do this for a good friend. Just think about that." His face changed in a moment. "My God!" he shouted. "I never realized. How can I thank you? It's just what I wanted. An opportunity to start again. I know I can do it. Look, I'm sorry. I can't stay. I'm too excited." I waved my hand as he ran from the room. I'd probably saved him from an early death, or perhaps from madness. But I felt sad. He was so young, and believed so fully in himself, and in the beauty of life. I was no longer young, and I knew that his fate, like mine, was written in large letters on the face of a rock, and nothing he could do would change it. My friend not only employed Jim, but welcomed him into his house. Unfortunately, only a year later, the second engineer from the Patna arrived unexpectedly in Rangoon, and Jim decided to leave the port at once. I was extremely disappointed to hear this, but helped Jim to find a second job in a port 1,000 kilometres south of there. His new employers thought a lot of Jim and trusted him with all their business. But one day the name of the Patna was mentioned, and Jim was too sensitive to bear it. Again he left the place immediately. From now on he moved from port to port to find work, trying to hide his terrible secret, until someone who knew the story spoke of it, and then he moved on again. I felt responsible for him, and helped and encouraged him as much as I could, but I knew that he was losing confidence in himself, although he was always cheerful and polite to me. What would be the end of it all? How long could Jim go on running away from his past? I decided to ask for advice from someone I trusted more than most men. He was a rich German trader called Stein, who had a large business buying and selling all kinds of things in the islands, ports, and jungle villages of the East. He was tall and thin, with a sympathetic, intelligent face, and white hair brushed back from a high forehead. Although his life had been long and adventurous, he now spent most of his time studying and collecting butterflies. In fact, by now he had become a world-famous collector. He was liked by everyone for the bravery of his past and the kindness he showed to all of us. When I visited him in his large, dark study, he was looking delightedly at the best butterfly in his collection. "A wonderful example," he said, smiling. "So beautiful, so perfect." "I have another example of nature to discuss with you," I said, "but I'm afraid it's a man, not an insect." His smile disappeared, but he listened encouragingly. "I understand very well," he said, when I had finished telling him Jim's story. "He is romantic." I felt like a patient asking his doctor for advice. so it seemed natural to say, "What is good for it?"
There is only one kind of medicine. One thing alone can stop us from being ourselves. Death.
The problem appeared simple, but hopeless. "Yes," I said, "so the real question is not how to get better, but how to go on living." Stein agreed sadly.
For a butterfly, it is enough to be beautiful and to live. But for man it is different, if he is sensitive. Every time he shuts his eyes, he sees himself as a hero, as a perfect man. It's all a dream. He can never be as fine as that. And so it is painful when he opens his eyes to find he cannot make his dream come true. It is terrible for him. But you ask me how to live? His voice sounded suddenly strong and confident. He looked away from me into the shadows of his past. There is only one way. Follow the dream, and again follow the dream, and so to the end. No doubt Stein was right. He had travelled very far in life, always bravely, always without hesitating, and fate had brought him friends, love, adventure. But it seemed a lonely, difficult life to me. "Nobody could be more romantic than you," I told him. "And sometimes you dream of a beautiful butterfly, but when it appears, you don't let the opportunity go, do you? You catch it. But Jim?" Stein lifted his hand. Do you know how many opportunities I have missed? How many dreams I have lost?
He shook his head sadly.
Perhaps I myself don't know. Everyone knows of one or two dreams like that. And that is the trouble. Well, it is getting late. Tonight you will sleep here, and tomorrow we will think of a way of helping the young man.
He showed me to my room and shook hands with me.
"Good night,"
he said. I watched him return the way he had come. He was going back to his butterflies. 5. Jim goes to Patusan. Marlowe's cigar had gone out. He stood up, moved to the edge of the veranda, and stared out into the darkness. Behind him, the circle of listeners in their armchairs waited for the story to continue. At last, one of them said encouragingly, "Well?" Marlowe turned to face them, carefully relit his cigar, and then continued with his story. "I don't suppose any of you have heard of Patusan. It doesn't matter. There are many stars in the sky that most people have never heard of, and which are of no importance to them anyway. Patusan was like one of these stars. It was occasionally mentioned by officials in Batavia, and it was known by name to a very few in the trading world. But nobody had ever been there, and I suspect nobody wanted to go there. That was where Stein arranged to send Jim. It was like sending him to the moon. He left his past world behind him and started a completely new life. Stein knew more about Patusan than anybody else. I have no doubt he had been there, perhaps looking for butterflies when he was younger. It was at breakfast the next morning after our talk about Jim that he mentioned the place. I had just repeated what poor Brierly had said to me. He should creep away somewhere and hide. Stein looked up at me with interest. "That could be done," he said, drinking his coffee. "You know, bury himself somewhere," I explained.
"Yes, he is young and could make another life for himself. Well, there is Patusan," he added, "and the woman is dead now."
I didn't know the woman he had mentioned, but I learned from Stein that she had been an intelligent, good-looking Dutch Malay girl. She had married a worthless Portuguese man who made her life extremely miserable. Because Stein felt sorry for her, he gave her husband a job as manager of Stein and Company's trading post in Patusan. Unfortunately, the Portuguese, whose name was Cornelius, was dishonest and lazy, so the trading post lost money. Now that the woman had died, Stein wanted to replace Cornelius, and he generously suggested offering the job to Jim. "There may be some difficulty with Cornelius," said Stein. "He'll be angry with Jim for taking his job. I don't think he'll want to leave Patusan, so he may cause trouble. But that has nothing to do with me. As he has a daughter, I think I shall let him keep the house he is living in, if he wants to stay." Patusan is an area of deep jungle, far up the river, about 60 kilometers from the sea. There is a native village of the same name. Behind the roofs of the native houses you can see the forest, and behind that there are two steep hills very close together, separated by a narrow valley. I saw all this later when I visited Jim in Patusan. We were standing outside the very fine house that he had built for himself on a warm, silent evening, watching an almost full moon rise behind the black hills. Red and round and nearly perfect, it sailed slowly upwards between the sides of the valley, finally moving away above the hilltops, like a soul escaping from a buried body. "Wonderful effect," said Jim by my side. "Worth seeing, isn't it?" He spoke proudly, and that made me smile. Did he feel he could control even the movements of the moon? He was in control of so many things in Patusan, things that had once seemed as far beyond his control as the moon and the stars. But Stein and I had no idea of this when we talked about sending him to Patusan. We both wanted to get him away from himself rather than anyone else. We knew he would be safer in a quiet, lonely place, with nobody who knew or cared about his past. I must tell you, however, that I had another reason for sending him away. I was about to go home to England for a while, and I think I wanted, more than I myself realized at the time, to be free of him. Do you understand? Before I left, I was going home, and he had come to me from there, with his miserable trouble and his shadowy dreams, like a man carrying something heavy on his tired shoulders in a thick mist. I cannot say I had ever seen him clearly, right up to the day when I had my last view of him. But the less I understood him, the closer I felt to him. After all, I did not know much more about myself. And then, I repeat, I was going home, to that distant place we all come from. We, the famous and the unknown, travel in our thousands all over the world, earning beyond the seas our good name, our fortune, or perhaps just enough bread for that day. But when we go home, we meet again our friends, our family, and others, those whom we obey and those whom we love. More than that, we have to meet the soul of the country that lives in its air, in its valleys, in its rivers and its trees, a wordless friend and judge. To breathe in the peace of home, to be happy there, I think we have to return with a clear conscience. I know that Jim felt something of this. He would never go home now. Never. He could not bear the idea of it. And so, like a much older brother, I felt responsible for Jim. I was worried about what would happen to him. For example, he could start drinking. The world is small, and I was afraid of meeting him one day in a foreign port, a red-eyed, dirty drunk, asking to borrow $5 from me. You know how often that happens. When you can only just recognize a sadly changed figure from the past, who reappears in your life for a moment. That seemed the worst danger I could see for him or for me, but I knew I had no imagination, and Jim had plenty. People with imagination often go further than others in life, for good or evil. How could I tell what Jim would do? You see, I'm telling you so much about my fears for him because there is not much of the story left. I hear you ask, was I right to be afraid for him? I won't say. Perhaps you can decide better than I can. Anyway, Jim did not go wrong. Not at all. In fact, he developed wonderfully and lived his life bravely and honestly to the end. I ought to be delighted because I was closely involved in his success. But somehow I'm not as pleased as I expected to be. I ask myself if he really managed to carry himself out of that mist in which I had seen him. And another thing, the last word has not been said, will probably never be said. Our lives are too short for anyone to judge us fully, and we ourselves never have time to say our last word, the last word of our love, our trust, our sadness, our guilt, our fight against the darkness. I won't tell you much more about Jim. In my opinion, he reached greatness, but you may see it differently. My words may not be enough to persuade you, as I'm afraid you people think more of your bodies than your imaginations. I don't want to be rude. It is sensible to have no dreams, and safe, and useful, and boring. But surely, my friends, you too have known, once in your time, the brightness of life, the fire that burns in you so strongly and unexpectedly